Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is a Wilson Center Global Fellow, Van Jackson, who is the author of this new book, On the Brink, Trump, Kim, and the Threat of Nuclear War. And as the old joke goes, Van's just flown in from New Zealand and his arms are killing him. How are you?
I'm great.
Good to see you.
Joke.
So let me ask you first about setting the scene for the discussion. Trump takes office, and there is all this venomous rhetoric flying back and forth between Presidents Trump and Kim. Yeah. And then we fast forward to today where they're practically sending love letters to each other. How did that change so dramatically?
So we got lucky that we were able to pivot from sort of the on the brink of nuclear war to this mood of détente and the diplomacy. But the reason we got lucky had a bit to do with Kim Jong-Un actually getting what he wanted. Kim was bent on getting a good enough nuclear deterrent, and he sort of achieved that on November 28th, 2017, when he successfully tested a missile that could have the technical range to reach Washington, D.C. At that point, he declared mission accomplished. And within 1 month, he pivoted to diplomacy, and it became this global charm offensive that was 2018. And all the Trump stuff, the love letters and all that, was part of that. It was one small part of this larger global campaign of diplomacy from a perceived position of strength, because we said he shouldn't get this nuclear deterrent, but then he big fat did anyway.
So in those early days where of the Trump administration, where there were lots of missile testing, was this a case of Kim testing Trump to see how far he could go, or was it more about what you just said, getting to the finish line of his objective?
So there was an element of testing Trump, and actually in the early months of the administration, you know, it looks now fatalistically like maximum pressure and the hard line was of course what the Trump administration was going to do. In the early weeks, you know, there was all this talk about like, well, I'd sit down and have a hamburger with him. You know, there was quiet backdoor diplomacy that was being set up, and then Kim Jong-nam, which is Kim Jong-un's older half-brother, got assassinated with a chemical weapon in Malaysia in an airport in broad daylight on video, and that made everyone think like, geez, maybe this guy's crazy, and therefore he can't be trusted with nukes, and therefore maximum pressure, and then that's how you get sort of into the crisis.
Where do you weigh in on the crazy question?
He's crazy as a fox. Basically, he had a goal, he pursued it with gusto, and then he achieved it. And right now, he is meeting with world leaders, and he's close to having some sanctions relief, and he has a very good relationship, I hear, with the American president. And he's gotten all of this. He's gotten everything he's set out to get so far. So he's got to be rational to succeed in this way.
Tell us about the basic premise of the subtitle about the brink of nuclear war. Is this hyperbole from a publisher, or did we really step up to the precipice?
So we were so on the brink that, and the argument is that we came closer than any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I lay out the historical context for that and why and how. But we were closer than we've been in a long time, and it was totally avoidable. And it had to do mostly with the fact that for the first time, the U.S. was mimicking Pyongyang's own strategy of brinkmanship. So you had brinkmanship meets brinkmanship, and neither side was backing down, and that was leading to...
It's an escalation game.
Yeah, and it was a question of like, where does this end?
So when we talk about on the brink specifically, are we talking about conditions where it wouldn't take much for somebody to get the proverbial itchy trigger finger and shoot first?
That's right. So there was multiple pathways to war, right? In Washington, there was a discourse building. Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator James Resch. There were a bunch of people who increasingly believed that it was so important to make sure Kim doesn't obtain nukes that a preventive war would be worth the effort to make sure it doesn't happen. So there was that Iraq War 2003 kind of narrative building, even in spite of Trump, because I don't know that he would want to go there, but that was happening and we were on that path. At the same time, there was a growing risk. We were basically playing Russian roulette. Every time every week passed by, there was some sort of miscommunication about an imminent indicator of war from Kim Jong-un's perspective. So like in April 2017, one of a million examples, Trump says we're sending an armada to North Korea. He says it publicly. And we weren't. The armada was an aircraft carrier that was heading to Australia, not Korea. But from Kim Jong-un's perspective, that's an indicator of war, and he doesn't know where it is. So that's really freaking scary from Kim Jong-un's perspective. He would have been totally within rationality to launch what he thinks is a preemptive strike, to send a deterrence message to the US to back off, because he thinks a war is imminent or something. And there were dozens of these false positive incidents where war could have been triggered and escalated, and we were just lucky.
So when you say we're lucky, what is our best guess? Did cooler heads prevail? Were there miscalculations in the positive where somebody didn't shoot first? What does getting lucky actually mean?
I mean, it means if you play Russian roulette enough times, it's guaranteed you're going to lose eventually.
Eventually, the odds, law of averages.
So and so that's sort of where we were. Whenever we were non-combatant evacuation operation, a NEO. This is another telltale sign that we're about to invade. We're getting all of our civilians out of the area. Everybody, including North Korea, knows that we do that right before we invade. So that's the sign. That's the flag going up in the North Koreans' mind. Bob Woodward's book said that Trump almost tweeted that we're going to do a non-combatant evacuation operation. In that same month, there was a text message that went out to U.S. dependents in South Korea saying that actually you need to evacuate immediately. There was a fake Facebook alert saying the same thing, right? We're imminently evacuating. There were news reports that senior officials in the Pentagon who were responsible for civilian evacuations were visiting Seoul in preparation of a civilian evacuation. And again, this for North Korea, they basically told us in the 90s, look, if we think you're going to hit us, we're going to hit you first.
Yeah.
So they're always looking for what's that trigger. A non-combatant evacuation operation is that key trigger.
From their perspective, how do you discern a bluff from the real deal?
And if you're monitoring South Korea and you're seeing Americans getting text messages again, he would have been justified in launching first strikes. We're lucky he didn't.
You mentioned Lindsey Graham, and in the book you quote him as saying, I don't know how to put North Korea in a historical context. Yeah. Do you take issue with this notion, or can they be placed in a historical context?
So that was almost like the emotional need of this book was, he was one of the advocates for preventive war at a certain point in 2017, and it was justified by not being able to put North Korea in a historical context. So this book was an attempt to do precisely that. Put North Korea in a historical context so we understand why they make the decisions they do and how there's this long history of missed opportunities and misperceptions. And so if we end up in war, it's because we weren't heeding the lessons of history. And so this is sort of a corrective.
Well, and South Korea's role in averting a war.
So pretty crucial, actually. They played a sort of passive role throughout the crisis. And then once Kim Jong-un declared mission accomplished, when he successfully tested his missile that could reach the U.S., at that point, his pivot to diplomacy involved pivoting not to the U.S., but pivoting to South Korea. And the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, had been holding out an olive branch for months, trying to get the North to come off of this fire and fury stuff. And at that point, when Kim Jong-un was ready, that hand was still outreached. And so there was something to grab onto. And it's safe to say that if Moon Jae-in was not president in South Korea at that time, Kim Jong-un wouldn't have had anything to pivot to for diplomacy. What's the proximate object that we're cooperating over? It was very easy to do that with South Korea's president there. So we got lucky that he happened to be the president at that time.
You cover a lot of ground concisely and effectively in this book, and you even go into the counterfactual. Yeah. What if Hillary Clinton had become president? What would U.S.-Korea policy have looked like? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it would have looked, so I talked to some of the people who were working on Asia for her campaign, and then we sort of made book on Hillary Clinton a long time ago in terms of her foreign policy disposition. And what I found was that there was a very high likelihood her North Korea policy would have looked like Obama's North Korea policy at the end of his administration. And that in itself doesn't look that different from maximum pressure. There's less fire and brimstone, less fire and fury.
But it's deterrence versus negotiation.
That's right. It's a hardline posture. It is sanctions. It is using China and the international community to kind of isolate North Korea and put the squeeze on. And that would have been the same. And that meant that a crisis was plausible even if there was never a Trump. Trump added his own unique flavor. He was the kind of catalyst with a lot of this rhetoric. but the conditions for crisis were already there, even in a Clinton administration.
In a former life, you were a policy advisor and strategist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. Yeah. And so now you're looking at this as an analyst from the outside, and you were on the inside of negotiations then. What looks very different from the inside that would be useful to, or from the outside that would be useful to know when you're on the inside, or vice versa? Who has the advantage?
Well, this is my own bias now, I guess, but I think the outsider actually has a certain advantage. When you're on the inside, you know, you have the advantage of knowing how the sausage is made, but that's pretty messy, and it's not pretty, and you're constrained by so many factors. You know, in what different parts of the U.S. interagency, what their interests are, and their conflicting interests across the bureaucracy. Public opinion matters. Where is the bureaucracy versus the president? How much does the alliance matter, or China, or whatever? And so you end up not being able to think clearly a lot of times. And what Korea policy needed desperately was for somebody to be able to step back and sort of assess
the passions of the moment or the politics involved.
Yeah, and because we were pursuing a goal with denuclearization that had the horse was out of the barn. North Korea had nukes, but we weren't politically able to reassess that.
So they have nukes, and they have a missile that can reach the United States East Coast. So what now? What do they want? What can they get? And are we willing to allow them to maintain a certain level of capacity?
It seems to me like we're implicitly willing to live with a certain amount of nuclear capacity, a certain number of warheads or something. And I don't know, maybe that's okay. We can't denuclearize them except by force. So what choice do we have? The issue is like, what are we willing to give up, and how durable or credible will any deal with North Korea be? And Trump has vacillated wildly in what he says about North Korea, what he's willing to do. And so we're going into a second summit, like literally anything could happen. That for an analyst, that's discomforting.
And for the rest of us as well, believe me. So when you look at the entire nuclear landscape, even beyond the U.S., North Korea, South Korea scenario, how stable or unstable is it?
So it's not as stable as I wish it were. And the reality is that you're never in a stable situation if you depend on the whims of individual leaders to prevent catastrophe. And that's kind of where we are. That's like a backwards form of extortion. And unfortunately, that's where we are right now. Stability will come. I mean, we're better off now than we were in 2017. That's a very low bar. Stability will come when we have greater confidence that North Korea will reduce the number of warheads that it has, that it will submit itself to verification and inspection so that we know where everything is, and literally reducing the available range of its missiles so that it can't strike U.S. territory anymore. That's progress, that's stability.
Along those lines of lessons learned of how do we reduce the risk moving forward, are there any other things we haven't talked about that are important to note?
Just that the history matters here, and the history strongly suggests that North Korea has no incentive to denuclearize in the way that Trump has repeatedly claimed. So there's nothing against Trump. It's just a reality that like Trump is a temporary phenomenon. He's at odds with like most of Washington opinion on this, and Kim Jong-Un knows that. He sees the Mueller investigation. He sees all of these like variables in play and all this uncertainty. In the context of nuclear weapons being an existential gamble for them, are they really going to give up that and make themselves strategically vulnerable in the context of Trump could be out of here tomorrow? Or even if he stays until 2020 or whatever, is the person that comes after him really going to hold to a deal that he makes?
Given that, is the relationship between North and South Korea the more important relationship than the U.S.-North Korea relationship?
Yeah, way more important. I really think that's where the real show is, and the Trump thing is a bit of a circus. The InterKorean diplomacy is, by Koreans, for Koreans. On the South Korean side, there's a lot of sincerity there, and they may be able to, they're not going to reach a solution on nukes, but they may reach a solution that makes the situation more peaceable. And the last thing the U.S. should want to do is get in the way of inter-Korean progress. So if they're making progress, it's like more power to them.
Van, thank you. Your mastery of the big picture and the details is impressive, as is the book On the Brink from Van Jackson. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Great.